All right, let's move to the issue of NAPLAN. It should concern all of us because we want to be a clever country, but we're certainly not clever if you look at world standards. And results from NAPLAN came out today. What does it mean for our school curriculum? What does it mean for teachers? What does it mean for the money that taxpayers spend? Almost $60 billion each and every year. We'll get into all of these issues with my panel who know more about education than I'll ever know. They are, joining me tonight, the wonderful Dr. Kevin Donnelly, who is now at the Australian Catholic University, Senior Research Fellow, and also Research Fellow in Education at the Centre for Independent Studies, Blaise Joseph, who's written a lot about NAPLAN. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. I want to start firstly on the issue of the NAPLAN test itself, so we don't get lost in all the debate about what sort of education system we have. Blaise, you've written about this a number of research papers in detail. The unions are calling for NAPLAN to be scrapped. That says to me, then by God, we've got to keep NAPLAN if the unions don't like it. But in terms of getting policy right, if you don't measure something, you can never improve it in my mind. And if we are spending all of this money, surely we want to see improvement for that money. How do you make it all?
That's absolutely right, Peter. I think what NAPLAN does is it provides really important data. We can see how we're going in terms of the key skills of literacy and numeracy from the national level all the way down to individual students. So it does provide that transparency and that accountability for the more than $50 billion of taxpayer money spent on schools every year. And let's not forget, our literacy and numeracy results have been going backwards on international tests. So it's important we have that data to see how we can improve.
All right, Kevin, what's your take on it?
Well, definitely correct. And you might remember, Peter, in 2005, I wrote a book, Why Our Schools Are Failing. And I looked at what was happening then. Nothing's changed in terms of improving our education system. In fact, it's got a lot worse given the increased expenditure. We're falling behind internationally, as was just mentioned. And the problem here is that whether it's Labor or Liberal governments, state or federal, the ministers seem to be captured very quickly by what I call the educrats, the educational bureaucrats. And so nothing really changes. And if I was a parent, I'd be deeply concerned that in another 5 or 8 years, we'll be sitting here talking about the same problem. Unless we have a root and branch renewal of our education system, nothing will really improve.
Well, let's put some graphics up there so people at home can follow some of the results that came out today. Year 3s, Year 5s, Year 7s, Year 9s that were tested. Grammar, punctuation, reading, spelling, numeracy, writing, all the things we care about. You can see where there's been positive changes there with the green arrows, but lots of no change at all and some negative change in the area of writing. Kevin, we have such a crowded curriculum. You know, kids think they've got PhDs in climate science by the time they've finished primary school. We've got all these other things that we teach them. But of course, when we test them about the basics. And I have to say, I don't think there's enough concentration on the basics. I sit here on the show and I talk about, you know, rivers where we need to dam and geography overseas and capital cities, and eyes glaze over sometimes with young people. They're not taught all of these things that probably you and I were taught many years ago, unfashionable as they are now. Do we have to get back to the basics? And if we have to, how do we do it? How do we cut through the bureaucracy and the teacher unions?
Well, there's no one solution here, no simple answer. We have to look at teacher training. We have to look at what's happening in the classroom in terms of pedagogy, how teachers actually teach. And in that regard, Australia doesn't do well. We also have to look at the curriculum, as you mentioned. And as you know, I co-chaired the review of the national curriculum in 2014. We recommended very strongly that we get rid of the crowded curriculum. We focus, especially in primary school, on the basics, what's essential learning, knowledge, skills. At the time, Christopher Pyne, the minister, didn't act on that. And the other question here is that when you look at how teachers actually teach, there's not enough memorisation, what we used to call rote learning, especially in the primary years, because all the developmental research, all the brain research, if you like, is showing that children have to learn whether it's timetables, reciting a poem, learning about events or dates.
Grammar.
It has to be automatic. It has to be automatic so that they can then be creative and meet more challenging demands. Now, there's a whole host of issues here that need to be addressed. What I'm afraid of is that we'll have another 3 or 4 years or another year where we don't address the question, and what federal, state ministers and territory ministers have to do is to stop listening to the bureaucrats. I mean, in New South Wales, for a moment, there's a review of the curriculum. It's talking about all these fads, all this gobbledygook. New South Wales will actually go backwards if that curriculum is implemented.
Yeah, I'm going to put up on the screen the graph of the expenditure increases. As I said at the start of the show, it's gone from $36.4 billion around 2007 to $57.7 billion. I'll put that up on the screen. You can see there's no shortage of money. I have to say, the Gonski money in particular is what I'd call political go-away money, money to make the problem go away. All the protesting of unions and others, Gonski meant better results. Of course, that's not been proven. I went through a UN study, I spoke about that earlier in the show, a UN study that has us 39 out of 41 high income to medium income countries in terms of our ranking, and 39 is towards the bottom. It's nowhere near the top for what we spend. Blaze, you know, the debate always gets caught up in the function of the money, not where we spend the money, just how much is there. One of the biggest grievances I had with the Gillard government was $16 billion on school halls, and all we did was plummet down the international league tables. How can we turn this around, and how can we get parents more involved in schools? Because I've seen the situation with independent schools in WA, independent government schools, of the like that really no other state has, and parents are really engaged. Principals get to hire and fire at that school, and their results are pretty outstanding.
Yeah, that's right, Peter. We do have to shift the focus of the discussion from how much money is spent to how it is spent. And you're right, I think principal autonomy and a more decentralised school system would help a lot. There's a lot of evidence that charter schools in the US, so they're basically publicly funded but privately run schools, there's a lot of evidence that they can be particularly beneficial for disadvantaged students. So we should be a bit more creative in thinking about how we can cater to our most disadvantaged students, particularly in the areas of literacy and numeracy. And just to pick up on something Kevin mentioned earlier, I think the real focus we should have at the moment is on teacher training. There's a lot of evidence now that Australian teacher education degrees are not adequately preparing new teachers. New teachers aren't equipped to teach literacy and numeracy in a rigorous, methodical way, and also new teachers aren't prepared to manage the classroom. And we know that from a series of studies here, and also the international surveys of teachers, which show that Australian teachers, new teachers, appear to be less prepared than their foreign counterparts. And that is something which is relatively easy to change. The state governments control the teacher accreditation. They can decide if a teacher education degree is valid or not. And for that reason, I think we really do need to focus in on improving teacher training in this country.
Well, Kevin, you're at a university, Australian Catholic University, that does a lot of teacher training and nurses training. I went through some statistics at the top of the show that demonstrated that 50% or thereabouts of our teaching cohort are coming from the lowest 50% of Year 12 school leavers. Clearly, the best and the brightest are not choosing teaching. I have friends that were teachers, friends that I went to school with and then university. They have left teaching because they can't stand, quite frankly, the bullshit of the common room, the teacher's common room, and all the politics of that. But also, there's not much advancement, and those that love teaching have to almost leave the classroom, go into the teaching sort of bureaucracy, become principals and other things in order to make money, but they're taken then away from what I think is their best use, teaching our children. How can we turn that around?
Well, that's a big issue. It's hard to know where to start. But you're dead right. I mean, up to 30% of teachers, beginning teachers, when they're surveyed, say that they cannot see themselves teaching in another 3 or 4 years. So there's a churning there, a turnover, which we have to address. But when you look at the question about teacher training and entry to a university, I think we have to be careful. Recently, there are a lot more pathways into university. I think it's only about 10% of students. If you raise the ATAR to 70, that only will affect about 10% of people going into teaching. And we have to remember that all our universities, especially at the ACU, teachers don't graduate, they're not certified unless they've met the standards. So I'd suggest that if they're doing a teacher education course over 4 years, they won't actually go into a classroom until they're prepared. But I get back to the point that there's no one solution here. As the Americans would say, no magic bullet. We have to look at a medium to long-term approach in terms of a whole range of issues.
Yeah, all right, well, this will be a topic I know we'll keep returning to. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Kevin Donnelly and Blaise Joseph.